I now call to order the lecture portion of the Society's 2,525th meeting in what is now the 154th year since its founding on March 13th, 1871. Good evening, everyone.
Good evening, Larry.
My name is Larry Milstein. I am the president of PSW, one of the oldest scientific societies of Washington, D.C., committed to providing a forum to further scientific understanding and inquiry to as broad an audience as possible. Welcome to our members, guests, and friends to the lecture part of today's PSW meeting and to the lecture by Jeffrey Alexander on the real returns on public research investments, new ways to measure accurately the true value of federally funded R&D. To start with, we want to thank the sponsors of PSW. So first, PSW member Mike Helton and Helton Associates LLC, a full year sponsor. Thank you, Mike, for your years of support. And PSW member Joe Schulman and the Schulman Foundation for their support. And finally, the sponsor of tonight's lecture, PSW member Federica Durema, who's here in the audience. Thank you, Federica, for this and your other sponsorships. The Society needs support to meet its expenses, and if you've not given or feel you can give more than you have, please do not hesitate to give. Now is an especially auspicious time to make donations because PSW is the beneficiary of a generous matching grant. Every dollar you give will be matched 2-to-1 up to the first $5,000 of donations. The match runs from November 1st through January 31st, so you can choose the most favorable of the 2 tax years. For some of us, that may be consequential. For others of us, maybe not so. But please do support PSW. It costs, you won't believe this number, about $100,000 to put on our 20 lectures a year. And all of that money is coming from people who support the organization. I am pleased to announce the following new members. John Montman, a civil engineer with Soltez Associates, interested in physics, cosmology, geology, biology, and anthropology, who earned a PSW from the PSW Meetup Group. Robert Earl DeLapp, a data scientist with the U.S. government, interested in physics, astronomy, medicine, and bioengineering, and AI, who earned a PSW from PSW's Millie Ho and Joseph Crandall. Frank Linton, an AI engineer with MITRE, interested in biochemistry, the origin of life, evolution, and astrobiology, earned a PSW from PSW member and recording secretary Scott Matthews. Audrey Gia, a regulatory consultant with Wonderful Land LLC, interested in drug development, particularly for rare diseases of children, who earned a PSW from LinkedIn. And Lindsay McKenzie, a journalist for FYI Science Policy News at the American Institute of Physics, interested in space policy and research funding and their impacts. Good lecture for her. Academic publishing and STEM education, who learned a PSW from listings in the FYI Science Policy News weekly newsletter events calendar. And Jeffrey Alexander, tonight's speaker, whose interests will be clear in part from his lecture here tonight. Please join me in welcoming them all to membership. All members are entitled to a signed copy of Compendium Volume 17, First Edition of the Bulletin of the PSW Science. If you are a new member and you haven't received yours, please see me after the lecture, and I will be happy to give you your copy. All members also are invited to the pre-lecture receptions and dinners with the speakers for camaraderie and interesting discussion. If you're interested in membership, you can access a membership application via the PSW website by clicking the blue Join button on the upper right-hand corner of the home page. And if you're here in the Powell Auditorium, you can access the application using the QR code on the business cards on the cocktail tables at the back of the room. Everyone with a genuine interest in science is welcome to apply for membership and join. Recording Secretary Scott Matthews will now present the minutes of the 2524th meeting and the lecture by John Sunderland on imaging with antimatter, high-resolution positron emission tomography. Scott, the stage is yours.
Thank you, Larry. Good evening. On November 7th, 2025, members of the Society and guests joined the speaker for a reception and dinner at 5:45 p.m. in the members' dining room at the Cosmos Club. Thereafter, they joined other attendees in the Powell Auditorium for the lecture proceedings. In the Powell Auditorium of the Cosmos Club in Washington, D.C., President Larry Milstein called the lecture portion of the 2524th meeting of the Society to order at 8:02 p.m. Eastern Time. He began by welcoming attendees, thanking sponsors for their support, announcing new members, and inviting guests to join the Society. Scott Matthews then read the minutes of the previous meeting, which included the lecture by Neil Johnson titled AI's Jekyll and Hyde Tipping Point, The Science of When Good AI Will Go Bad. The minutes were approved as read. President Milstein then introduced the speaker for the evening, John Sunderland of the University of Iowa. His lecture was titled Medical Imaging with Antimatter, High-Resolution Positron Emission Tomography. The speaker began by describing positron emission tomography, or PET, as being inherently multidisciplinary, involving physics, biochemistry, synthetic organic chemistry, medicine, and engineering. He indicated that PET does not image anatomy, rather it images specific biochemistry in the human body. He presented an example image showing the glucose metabolism in a patient after injecting a tiny amount of radioactive glucose. He described the beta plus decay process in which a nucleus with too many positive charges emits a positron, the antimatter version of an electron. He showed how the positron combines with an electron after propagating a very short distance and creates two gamma rays of exactly 511 keV, propagating in opposite directions. Sunderland described three discrimination processes used to separate electron-positron annihilation from other detection events. These included energy discrimination, temporal discrimination, and geometrical discrimination. Energy discrimination, or pulse height discrimination, relies on the fact that the magnitude of the electrical pulse generated at the detector is proportional to the energy of the detected particle, and electron-positron annihilation generates monoenergetic gamma rays. Temporal discrimination, or coincidence counting, relies on the fact that the two gamma rays arrive at the detectors almost simultaneously within a few nanoseconds. And geometrical discrimination, which relies on the fact that the two gamma rays propagate exactly 180 degrees from one another, meaning that they are detected on diametrically opposed detectors. These three discrimination mechanisms result in exquisite sensitivity to electron-positron annihilation, filtering out all other detection events and allowing practitioners to use extremely small quantities of radioactive materials. The speaker then discussed the motivation for characterizing and imaging glucose metabolism in the human body, saying that most cancer cells metabolize glucose extremely inefficiently. As a result, a cancer cell needs to burn glucose at a much higher rate than normal cells in order to support cellular function. Sunderland showed a PET image of a patient with breast cancer. He said that although the patient's CT scan came back normal, 4 malignant lymph nodes were clearly visible in the PET image. Sunderland discussed the fact that PET scanning is a, quote, tracer methodology. That is to say that the quantity of injected material must be so small as to not perturb the biochemical system being probed. He discussed the biochemical optimization of tracer molecules used in PET scans, giving the example of labeling glucose with carbon-11 as compared to fluorine-18. He said that C11 glucose would be metabolized into CO2 and would rapidly begin to diffuse throughout the body. Fluorodeoxyglucose, labeled with F18, is metabolized differently and therefore remains sequestered in the cell. The speaker presented a brief introduction to nuclear physics, emphasizing radioactive isotopes. He showed the chart of the nuclides, describing beta decay, neutron-rich nuclei decaying with the emission of an electron, and proton-rich nuclei decaying with the emission of a positron. He mentioned nuclei which decay by alpha emission, saying that they were relevant to radiotherapy. Sunderland said that many unstable nuclei, whether decaying by alpha or beta processes, will create a nucleus in an excited state, which subsequently emits a gamma ray. He indicated that gamma rays produced by nuclear decay or electron-positron annihilation are important messengers, as they have a high likelihood of leaving the body and being detected in scintillators. The speaker discussed the processes for producing PET scan tracers, including using cyclotrons to create the isotopes, chemical synthesis under aseptic conditions, and remote handling in, quote, hot cells due to the high levels of radioactivity. He discussed the desired characteristics for these isotopes: half-life long enough to be delivered to a clinical site, but short enough to allow image formation in a reasonable period of time. Sunderland discussed the diversity of PET radiopharmaceuticals, including about 15 that are approved for clinical use. He presented a list of the most common compounds, the isotopes they incorporate, and the specific clinical uses of each. He showed specific examples of PET imaging for prostate cancer, breast cancer, neuroendocrine tumors, and amyloid proteins for Alzheimer's disease. Sunderland claimed that new compounds currently under development are likely to have a significant impact on a wide variety of disease conditions, including colorectal cancer, pancreatic cancer, ovarian cancer, cardiac disease, neurological disease, T-cell activation, etc. The speaker then described the functioning of a PET scanner. He described the detector array, rings of tens of thousands of scintillation crystals, optically coupled to light sensors, feeding signals to fast electronics which implement discrimination and record each event. He indicated that older PET systems use photomultiplier tubes for light detection, but that modern systems use silicon photomultiplier arrays, which dramatically increase the image quality and resolution. He described the computer-based image reconstruction process known as tomography, the numeric reconstruction of a three-dimensional image from a series of two-dimensional slices, each acquired from a different perspective. The speaker ended his talk by describing targeted radiopharmaceutical therapy, injecting much larger doses of radioactive compounds, which will preferentially bind to tumor cells, such that the tumor cells receive a much higher percentage of the radiation than the surrounding healthy tissue. He described how PET imaging techniques could be used to measure the absorbed dose of radiation in specific organs in order to, quote, personalize the dosage for each patient. The lecture was followed by a question and answer session. A member asked about the scintillators currently used in PET imaging, asking if sodium iodide crystals were still used. Sunderland responded that sodium iodide is still widely used for gamma cameras, but that most modern PET systems employ lutetium orthosilicate crystals, which are very fast, very dense, and have good energy resolution. A new member asked about time-of-flight imaging and whether such techniques could be pushed to the femtosecond scale. Sunderland responded that there are physical limits primarily associated with the size of the scintillation crystals, i.e., the time delay associated with a gamma ray interacting with the front surface, the back surface, or somewhere in between. Decreasing the thickness of the scintillators would reduce the uncertainty in time, but would compromise the absorption. A guest on the live stream asked if it would be possible to combine data from PET scans, CAT scans, MRI images, and X-ray images and use AI to improve diagnosis and treatment. Sunderland responded, quote, theoretically, absolutely yes, unquote. However, he indicated that the primary difficulty of such data fusion is HIPAA, Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, which limits the ability of practitioners to share medical data. After the question and answer period, President Milstein thanked the speaker and presented him with a PSW rosette, a signed copy of the announcement of his talk, and a signed copy of Volume 17 of the PSW Bulletin. He then announced speakers of upcoming lectures and made a number of housekeeping announcements. He adjourned the 2,524th meeting of the Society at 9:50 p.m. Eastern Time. Temperature in Washington, D.C., 15.6 degrees Celsius. Weather, mostly cloudy. Audience in the Powell Auditorium, 66. Viewers on the live stream, 32, for a total of 98 viewers. Respectfully submitted, Scott Matthews, Recording Secretary.
What about the 2 weeks? Viewers in the first 2 weeks? Viewers in the first 2 weeks? Okay. Thank you, Scott. Scott forgot one thing, which is the number of viewers in the first 2 weeks, but he'll put that in the written version that gets posted to the web. I think it was about 200. But are there any comments or corrections to the minutes? Hearing none, I will accept the motion to accept the minutes as read. A second. All members in favor? All members opposed? The minutes are accepted as read. Will be posted to the website in due course. Tonight's lecture by Jeffrey Alexander. Jeff is the Director of Innovation Policy at RTI International. He is also President of DC Chapter of the Technology Transfer Society and serves on the steering committee of the AAAS section on the societal impacts of science and technology. Jeffrey's research focuses on evaluating the efficacy, and impact of public investments in science, technology, and innovation. His projects are focused on novel data sets and advanced analytics to forecast emerging fields and technology. They involve the development of machine learning and text analytical methods to classify research grant records, and the application of big data mathematical analytical methods to problems in R&D management and innovation policy. He's assessed large federal research and innovation programs, and his policy work has informed the design of institutions for research commercialization and the assessment of regional innovation clusters. He is an author on numerous peer-reviewed publications and a number of book chapters and edited volumes. Among other honors and awards, he is a non-resident fellow at the New America and a member of the Polaris Council. Jeffrey earned a BA in International Relations at Stanford and a PhD in Management and Technology at the George Washington University School of Business. All questions will be held until the Q&A session after the lecture concludes. For now, the stage is yours, Jeffrey.
Great. Well, again, thank you very much for the invitation here. If you'll indulge me, I'm going to start with a small personal anecdote about my first visit to the Cosmos Club, which was back in 1988. I was a rising junior at Stanford and decided early on I was interested in science policy and applied for a summer internship and was extremely fortunate to end up working at the American Association for the Advancement of Science for Al Tyke, who, as you may know, if you knew Al when he was alive, he was a longtime director of science policy for AAAS. When I got here, Al said, in addition to my intern duties, I'd have a long-term assignment, which was one of the senior members of AAAS was traveling to China to deliver a course on patent law and how that was important for technology development, and he needed an outline for the course. And so I did this work, and Al said, okay, well, we're meeting this member at the Cosmos Club for lunch, so you can describe what you found. I did not realize at the time, but the member I was meeting was the Honorable Emilio Daddario, or Mimi Daddario. He was a representative who represented Connecticut in Congress from 1959 to, I believe, 1972. He was also the founding director of the Office of Technology Assessment. So a very illustrious person, and at the time was the president of the National Conference of Lawyers and Scientists, which is how he was going to China for this activity. The most memorable part of it, I have to admit, is that we sat down in one of the sitting rooms, and I pulled out my portfolio, being the eager undergraduate that I was, to show him the outline that I had prepared. And a member of the staff of the Cosmos Club walked over and said, "Excuse me, you have to put your papers away. Members are not permitted to conduct business in this room." So I'm like, okay, now I've arrived in Washington, D.C. They clearly do things differently than where I'm from in California. But it was a great experience, and really, again, I really enjoyed this building and the setting. So the topic I'm going to discuss is, again, what I would term the real returns on public investments in science technology. You probably have heard the question, and I've been asked the question many times, what is the return on investment, or ROI, for what we spend on science and technology or scientific research? It's, by the way, a question that I detest, but I try to answer it in any case. I actually prefer to use this term, what is the value of those investments, because value is more all-encompassing. Return on investment is a financial term, and as the son of a CPA and somebody with a PhD in business, I view the financial lens to be actually extremely limiting. But it is a question that we get asked very often and have to have a credible answer for. I will start out by noting that much of the data I'm going to be providing is data we collected as part of a project funded by the National Institutes of Health Intramural Research Program, specifically through their Office of Technology Transfer. And I am required, of course, to say that none of these views that I'm going to be telling you are a reflection of the NIH, the US government, RTI International, or anybody other than myself. So please don't blame them for what I say. If you're curious, RTI International is actually known as the Research Triangle Institute. So we are a nonprofit contract research organization based in Research Triangle Park, North Carolina. We primarily perform contract research for federal agencies. And my group, as President Milstein mentioned, does a lot of essentially working with the funders of scientific research to help them determine, are they funding the right kind of research, and are those funding programs being run well and according to their strategic plan? So this question of what is the value of all those investments comes up quite frequently, right? I'm going to talk to you a little bit about actually the nature of federal R&D spending. As the famous computer scientist John von Neumann once said, there is no point in being precise if you have no idea what you're talking about. So I figure it'd be good to tell you what the nature of federal spending is in science technology. And I'll also then discuss some common ways I've seen people try to explain the return on investment in research and development that are actually, I think, doing more harm than good. Then I'll discuss this specific project and the approach we took to try to provide a more precise and comprehensive view of the value of, in this case, research conducted on the NIH campus in Bethesda, Maryland. And I'll end with the lessons learned from this project and all of my other experiences doing R&D evaluation for federal agencies, philanthropic foundations, and other sponsors. I should have looked at that. So first of all, I'll present some data that were taken from the National Center for Science and Engineering Statistics at the National Science Foundation. I believe it is actually a part of the NSF that is not very well known, but drastically undervalued. They basically collect all the data on the state of the science and engineering enterprise in the United States, including human capital, spending, all kinds of other statistics. They also are the body that produces what's called the Science and Engineering Indicators, which is actually a publication of the National Science Board of the NSF. And I've had the good fortune to work for NCSES as a contractor in helping them with their data collection and in producing the SNE indicators. So you'll see them noted prominently in the following figures. So just so you're aware, U.S. spending on R&D is obviously $172 billion. So these are all given in billions of dollars. $172 billion is spent by the federal government on research and development, or it was in 2022, the year for which we have the most reliable statistics so far. There's a little bit of a lag there. Note that actually business vastly outspends the federal government. And but the nature of that research is quite different from federally funded research, as I'll explain in a minute. But most of the research that the federal government funds is performed at universities, not surprisingly perhaps. But federal agency, what are called the intramural laboratories, perform, again, about 26% of that federal R&D. Intramural labs are labs that are owned and operated by federal agencies and staffed by federal scientists. So think about many of the NASA space centers, think about NIST, think about many of the USDA laboratories, several of the Department of Defense laboratories. Those are the intramural labs. There's also a slightly smaller share that's being spent at what are called the federally funded research and development centers. These are labs that were especially a type of lab founded during the Manhattan Project. So these are laboratories that are owned by the government but run by contractors. So in this case, think about Sandia National Lab, Los Alamos, Lawrence Berkeley, Jet Propulsion Lab, Lincoln Labs for the Defense Department. So they are federal laboratories in nature, but they are actually not considered intramural labs per se. What you hear talked about more extensively is the extramural research. So these are the research grants that are given to especially university researchers, but also businesses. But again, these are being performed by non-federal actors, non-federal performers outside of the government. Note that this is all being collected under a very systematic rules for federal science statistics. The Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development in Paris sets the international standards for how we do this measurement. And they note, just for very aware, that research and development are the activities that they must be novel, creative, uncertain, systematic, and transferable and reproducible. This is going to be important later, especially the idea of the uncertainty involved in R&D, that if you can already predict what research is going to produce, it is probably not, in fact, research. So let's look instead at what's the funding on just basic scientific research, right? So this is really research that's fundamental in nature. In fact, it's defined by OECD as experimental or theoretical work undertaken primarily to acquire new knowledge of underlying foundations of phenomena and observable facts without particular application or use in view. That's kind of an interesting stipulation for how we define basic research, as I'll talk about in a minute. So basic research is primarily funded by the US government here in the United States. There is a substantial and actually growing amount of research that is funded by businesses. But the federal government mostly funds this. It's mostly being conducted at universities. But again, a slightly smaller share is being done at the federal laboratories and the FFRDCs. A lot of the federal laboratories, because they're run by mission agencies, they actually are more applied in nature, right? So NIH is dedicated to advancing human health. It does research on advancing human health, right? So it does have an application in mind, and yet a portion of this research is fundamental in nature. I mean, what they're looking at is the nature of human health and biology, and how do we understand that. One thing to also note is that about 65% of the research conducted at universities by spending is supplied by the federal government. So that kind of shows you, again, that the universities are a key player here, but the federal intramural research system does, in fact, play a role. So again, as you can see here, about 14% of federal basic research is going to federal intramural laboratories, and 10% go to the FFRDCs. So a natural question is, what are we getting for the $172 billion we spent in 2022, as an example, right? We're spending all this money. We should, especially as taxpayers, know what is the benefit that we are earning, right? I think that's a natural question. It's a question that actually has not been asked until relatively recently. There was a long period of what's called the golden age of science, where basically we trusted scientists to choose these research projects and gave them money, and they did peer review, and they funded those things based on peer review. But now there is a new era, I think, in the last 20 or 30 years in particular, of accountability, right? Just as, we have to justify, why are we not spending this on, for example, elementary school education, or spending it on criminal justice, or spending it on national defense. Obviously, some of these agencies that do those missions are doing R&D as well. But the key issue here is, how do you really explain the benefit that's being generated by this spending? So a common way that we compare the R&D performance of nations is a statistics that's basically calculated as national spending on research and development as a share of gross domestic product, right? GDP is your total national economic output in a year. And so if you look at what's called the research intensivity of a national economy, that's a way that we kind of judge of who's really kind of serious about research and a major player in the research system looking globally. And so this statement made by President Barack Obama at the National Academy of Sciences, is actually his first public address as president, was to say that he was going to be making a renewed commitment to research and development, and that he would ensure that 3% of GDP was being spent on R&D. Again, interesting to note that most of that R&D spending is done by the private sector. So the federal government really can't move that needle very much. But nevertheless, we kind of view that as a way of showing, yes, we're serious about research. We're spending this amount of money. So how, in fact, are we doing? So you see back here in 2008, 2009, when President Obama made that address, we were spending around 2.7, 2.8% of GDP on R&D. We didn't cross this 3% threshold until about 2018, but we've actually advanced quite a bit since then. Again, 2021 are the latest statistics we have, unfortunately, because apparently the UK is doing some very funny things with their statistics that we can't quite identify, and so their spending has been disqualified from inclusion in these statistics, so I'm giving you the best estimate I can. So, again, we seem to have done what we said we were going to do, although, many years later, we are spending 3% of our GDP on research and development. But look at South Korea, which is clearly far ahead of us in research intensivity. Do we accept that South Korea is somehow by nature more innovative than us, that they are making greater contributions to global science technology, that they have, better research going on? I think that there's debate about that. It's also interesting to observe the advances of China on this chart. So China actually does have a lower R&D intensivity than the United States. But of course, the size of the Chinese economy is so large that in absolute terms, they are basically at parity or spending more than we are. So this R&D intensivity is not necessarily correlated with research excellence or research output or things of that nature. And so it's very hard to say exactly on this basis of who are the underperformers or who is underinvesting in research and development. The reason why this is dangerous is that this is essentially a statement of what's called the linear model, which is that we can judge R&D performance by the inputs, right? So this is a typical conceptualization of how research works. Right? You put in a certain amount of research dollars. The various actors do this, applied research. They do some development. They do design, production, start selling things, and you have products that then and services that benefit the nation. How do you improve your R&D performance? You basically boost your research spending, and everything else also goes up at the same time. Right? We actually know this is not at all how research works, and this is not how we get the benefit of research, right? It's not about the amount of money you spend or the R&D intensivity. It's really not even about what you spend it on. It's really more about what is the efficiency with which you can convert research dollars into commercial and other kinds of products and services that benefit the citizens of the United States and the world, and really think about what is the nature of what we're funding and why we're funding it. So the problem is that here in DC, everybody tends to focus on the budget numbers, and they don't really focus on what the outcomes are. There's a famous scholar in Canada, late scholar Benoit Gaudin, who's written extensively about the linear model and it's how it came to be. And a lot of it is actually because this is built into our statistical system. In particular, the Defense Department during the Vietnam War created this system called, 6-1, 6-2 research, right? The basic research, applied research. And we've now scaled that up to the entire US science system. And we just are counting things as going from basic to applied to development and not really think about what are we really counting when we do that. So I call this the fallacy of causality, right? So does all research spending necessarily produce useful goods and services? Probably not, again, because research is uncertain. Also think about the lag between the spending and the production. So we do research today. How long do we have to wait till that production takes place or those benefits accrue to us, right? We actually don't know very much about that. And again, the idea of just simply measuring R&D performance by the inputs, to my mind, that would be similar to me saying, I, consumed a whole bunch of calories yesterday, therefore I am more physically fit today. I don't think anybody would make that argument, but that's essentially what we're saying if we basically grade nations by their R&D spending. So what's be another way for us to calculate this ROI of scientific research spending? A very common example that I've heard given by actually notable government leaders is, well, look at what happened with the PageRank grant. Right? So those of you who may know the history of Google, so the National Science Foundation gave a $4.5 million research grant to Stanford to two computer scientists, Terry Winograd and Hector Garcia Molina. They had two very smart and enterprising PhD students who were Larry Page and Sergey Brin. In '96, they basically developed what was called the PageRank algorithm, a new way of indexing all the pages on the World Wide Web. And they launched a search engine on the Stanford servers called Google. They tried to sell this idea to a number of companies, got no takers. There were a lot of competing search engines at the time. I don't know how many people here remember Inktomi, AltaVista, Ask Jeeves. In fact, there was like so many search engines. There was a very famous story by a venture capitalist who was over having dinner with a friend of his, and this friend said, by the way, I know you're a venture capitalist. There are these two young Stanford PhD students working in my garage, and they're inventing a new search engine. And the venture capitalist said, please show me the quickest way from your house that does not involve going through the garage. Right? Because the search engine was like, oh, this is a dead-end business, right? There's way too many competitors. Well, Sergey Brin and Larry Page formed Google. Interestingly, they, of course, had to license the patent from Stanford. So under the rules, which I'll explain later, Stanford owned the intellectual property of the PageRank algorithm. And so when they formed Google as a startup, they had to essentially buy permission to use their own technology that they invented in the nature of a license. And because Google was a startup, they had no assets. So in lieu of paying Stanford cash, which is normal with these licenses, they gave Stanford 1.8 million shares of stock in the startup company. In 2005, Google had an initial public offering. The market capitalization at IPO of Google was $23 billion. Stanford immediately sold all of its stock in Google, which I'll explain why they did that later if you're curious. But they netted $336 million, right? Fast forward 15 years, Google, also called Alphabet now, had a market cap of over $1 trillion. So the question for you is, what would you say is the return on investment on that $4.5 million grant? You could say it's basically the $335 million, which is a 747x return on investment. Granted, that all went to Stanford, right? So that's one way you could calculate. If you look at return on investment, it was the scale of the monetary return relative to the original investment. You could say that it was the $23 billion market cap of Google at IPO, because obviously Google would not exist but for the PageRank algorithm. Therefore, we can say that the market cap of Google is attributable to the PageRank algorithm, and therefore now we get a 5,111x ROI. You could even go so far to say, well, all $1 trillion of market cap of Google in 2022 is really related to the PageRank algorithm. So at that time, it was 222,222 times the original investment, right? Or you could say it was none of the above, right? So what are some of the issues that come about? And I've actually heard people say, oh, the market cap of Google is X. $4.5 million is, what percentage of that? So we've got this huge ROI from that $4.5 million grant. So this is the fallacy of attribution, right? How much of Google's current market value is really attributable to PageRank? Sure, the startup would not exist but for PageRank. But if you look at their revenue structure today, a lot of their revenue is made from the sources that are far removed from search engines. So we can't really say, especially the entirety of their market cap today is attributable to PageRank. Not even their market cap at IPO, because they were already moving into advertising, which is based upon their search engine algorithm, but was not actually reliant upon it. But also, who actually provided the support for Google? Was it just the NSF's $4.5 million? Or would you also want to count all of the investments that Stanford made, including, time and materials and things like that were not covered by the grant? Clearly the environment at Stanford contributed to the success of this company. More importantly, every time that the Google market cap fluctuates, every time their share price ascends, is the ROI from that research investment changing? So do we really want to argue that on a daily basis, the ROI for R&D spending changes based on the whims of the public stock market? Right. So this is kind of, I think, the fallacy of when you try to apply these kind of financial metrics to the returns from R&D, you get into these very, very kind of tenuous kinds of connections that are really hard to support when you look at them more closely. So a third way that we've seen people argue for the ROI on R&D is what's called input-output modeling. In the case of the National Institutes of Health, there is a widely circulated report that's actually produced every year by a group called United for Medical Research. And so what they do is they say, well, okay, NIH in 2024, for example, gave out about $37 billion in research grants to U.S. universities and medical schools, right? So they use this economic technique called input-output modeling. I'll explain more later. We use the same technique. Basically, the argument is, okay, you inject this money into the economy. That induces a lot of follow-on spending. So I give these universities this money. They go out and hire a bunch of people. They go out and buy a lot of equipment and supplies. Well, that revenue for the equipment and supplies accrues to those companies. So you're generating revenue for other entities beyond just the university. The people who are paid, have their salaries paid by the grant, like the researchers and the grad students, they go out to eat dinner. That restaurant gets revenue that would not exist but for this grant. And so it's basically this idea of what is the multiplier that you would apply to say that this is kind of, because of the way the economy works, additional economic activity that is tied directly to this original investment. So if you looked at that 2024 spending and you count all of this, what's called the direct impact, the impact of the spending, indirect impact of the supplies that they buy, and then induced impact of the people who spend that money on goods and services. UMR calculated that in 2024, 407,782 jobs in the United States were attributable. Their support for those salaries was attributable to NIH extramural spending. And basically, by translating that through what's the ratio, they determined that each dollar in NIH grants generated $2.56 of economic activity, so 2.5x, which is not great, but it's pretty impressive. I mean, I defy you to find a lot of other investments that get that kind of ROI. This is what I would term the fallacy of uniformity, that every dollar we spend on research produces a similar kind of impact, right? So do we really think that all of the research spending at NIH produces $2.56 of output for every dollar of input? Obviously, they fund research grants, they fund training grants, they fund infrastructure. So we're kind of like trying to mix all of these apples and oranges into a one soup. What's especially interesting is that, all you're saying is that however much NIH spends on research and development and the economic activity it induces, it will just go up if you spend more. So this is just really a retread of the linear model, right? Put more money in the front end, you get more economic output and impact on the back end. There are some very weird mathematical things that go on in this kind of modeling. So for example, I just did some back of the envelope calculations, and looking back on previous reports found that in 2014, $1 billion in NIH awards at that time supported 14,000 jobs, whereas looking at the 2015 report, $1 billion in NIH awards only supported 11,000 jobs. So we actually spent more money, and by this calculation, we created less employment. I have a feeling that this was due to inflation and some other variables that are inherent in the IO modeling, but it does kind of raise a lot of issues. If we do this kind of idealistic economic modeling, are we really telling the whole story about the return on investment in R&D? So think about what might be alternatives to the linear model, right? We know that what you put into the system doesn't necessarily directly correlate to the outputs. So what's really going on inside the system that would help us get a better handle on what those impacts are? So, the linear model is basically true, right? We have, for example, especially in a company, they either do basic research or they get the results of basic research from outside parties. They do something internally. They'll create a new proof of concept. They'll do the initial testing. They'll get a prototype out the door. If they're successful, they can develop that, scale it up, and eventually get this to the marketplace, right? That linear pattern does exist. The problem is that there are actually multiple feedback loops. So you'll often find that you get to the development scaling up phase and you don't know exactly how to do that. So you got to go back to do basic research to figure out the right way to do that production. And essentially, there's also this whole stock of knowledge that is created by other basic research spending. So this fundamental scientific and engineering knowledge is often produced by universities, also with federal money. Some of that gets converted through both private and public organizations into applied knowledge. Companies then turn that into proprietary knowledge that applies just to their goods and services. So again, there's a lot of kind of components to the system that we don't take into account with the linear model. Usually when you look at what are the interim outputs of each of these phases, we have things like, okay, you'll know that a publication from a scientific journal maybe is the output of a basic research project. Proof of concept, you might get a patent, right? You get that to the actual idea of a prototype you can market, then that's a business plan, and then you actually can count product and firm. So you can see what are the outputs that could be linked to that input of research spending. But again, that relationship and the ratios are not easy to discern. And what's especially interesting is that the people and the actors involved are very different. So, again, at this early stage, it's a lot of federal agencies and private philanthropies that fund this early basic research. As you go along, you get angel venture investors like startup investors, seed funds. Government still, funds some of this stuff, especially the Defense Department. As you go downstream, it's really the venue or the purview of corporate R&D, venture capitalists. Government loans often play a role here, especially for Department of Energy. And then eventually it does become almost purely private money that's fueling the actual production. The government basic research is all contained in this circle. And again, the challenge is how do we look at everything coming out the tail end of this pipe and accurately attribute it to all that's going in at the front end? This is, in fact, I believe, a more accurate model. This based on a number of works done over the years by folks like Nathan Rosenberg at Stanford, Mark Myers and Richard Rosenblum at Harvard Business School, Maria Mazzucato, who's very popular right now from University of Sussex originally. It's really accurate. It's also extremely confusing. And so I think one of the things that we have to recognize is that essentially the tyranny of the linear model, the reason why the linear model persists, even though we know it's false, is that it's actually very easy to understand. If you go up to Congress and say, give me more money and you get more output, that's a much easier argument to make than say, give me some money and there's going to be all this stuff that happens and we don't really understand it and it's all going to be kind of feedback loops and blah, 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 and then we'll get some kind of output, right? Very hard to kind of translate this into, a justification for spending. But we need to recognize that these are the dynamics that we're dealing with. So this really tells us a little bit about the characteristics of the U.S. innovation system, right? The system is widely distributed. So it's not just one organization that takes the basic research money and ends up commercializing the results. It's a whole bunch of different organizations along the way. The innovation process, of course, is highly uncertain. Research is uncertain. Technology development is uncertain. Even commercialization and business formation and small business survival is uncertain. Failures happen for all kinds of reasons that are unrelated to the quality of the research. So you might run out of money. You don't have the right people at the right time to get this thing to move forward. You thought you had a great solution, but then you tried to engineer it and nothing. It didn't work out. You don't know why. So again, it's not that the research was bad quality that led to the failure. There are just reasons why research fails. Not to mention the fact that research is supposed to fail, right? If we actually, again, knew what the outputs of research were, if we knew every research project was going to be successful, we would not be doing research. We would be doing just straight engineering. So that is something we have to keep in mind when we're trying to calculate the value of R&D. What's interesting for me about when you're calculating the value of R&D, failure has value, right? You learn what doesn't work. You then apply that knowledge back into your research agenda. So how do we quantify the return on investment on failure in science? Nobody, to my knowledge, has that answer. But one of the main things you have to take away from this is that really tracing the connection between the original research and the outcomes is really difficult to do, and you need a lot of ways to kind of trace this. So my central thesis is this. Attempting to calculate the financial return on investment from federally funded research is a misleading, misguided, and incomplete assessment of the actual value generated by that research. And I'll go into the detail of why I use those three terms in particular. But there is a huge problem that we have because when we start applying financial terms like ROI, if you follow the linguistics professor George Lakoff, when we argue by analogy and metaphor, the metaphor actually kind of takes over our thinking. So if we really think about R&D as an investment, like a financial investment, and R&D produces these returns are fungible. They all accrue to a certain, if I get the return on the investment, then you don't, which is not the case in research. If I do research and get benefit, I generate knowledge and that benefits you as well. It makes you think of it really about how do we maximize that return on investment? How do we get the most monetary value? Which is not why we're doing the research, right? A lot of this public research is to advance public missions. And how do you quantify the value of, the fact that we feel more secure against, foreign adversaries? Very hard to kind of make that assessment. So this is the issue that you have, that you really are not capturing the meaning of the value. And also ROI has a very specific meaning in the accounting world and a specific way of calculating it. So for example, you do have to take into account the time value of money, right? I spend the money now and it takes 20 years to get the return. Then that's not as great as if I spend it now and get a return next year. So there are all these factors that are wrapped up in this term ROI that we tend to just kind of gloss over. So we were given the task of calculating the returns on the investments in the intramural research program at NIH. Right. So again, NIH, everybody kind of knows, is this, the largest funder of biomedical research. And the intramural program, which I'll explain in a minute, is the research done by the NIH scientists on the NIH campus and a couple other locations. And interestingly, I'll tell this backstory on this, but this project was not really about getting the impact of the IRP, but actually the impact of the activities of their technology transfer office. But essentially, that's what we ended up calculating was the impact of the IRP. Now, in my view, there's a right way to at least start approaching this question of the value of R&D. And that is, you first characterize the activities that are supported and their outcomes, right? You want to really kind of take a look, okay, what research are you funding? What is that research producing? How do you kind of explain and characterize and kind of describe those outputs, right? You then communicate or think about how to communicate how benefits that you observe are related to the outcomes. And I use this very specifically that, yes, it's great to talk about the ROI as like a numerical value, but honestly, what changes minds are stories. And if we don't think up front about the story that we're telling about the investment in research, then we're actually going to fail before we even get started. Once you've figured out the communication, then you can start to quantify. And keep in mind that, of course, there are a lot of benefits that are not quantifiable. That doesn't mean that they don't exist. There are qualitative ways of qualitative evidence that you can generate about what happens with research. But quantitative evidence does tend to sway minds for various reasons a little bit more readily. But the key thing to remember is that if you communicate and tell a story about federal research and you don't have the evidence, you're just selling a fantasy, right? So you can tell a good story about research, but you got to back it up with actual data. So what we do is we basically develop indicators that do this characterization of the impacts of research. And indicator, I turn back to my friends at the National Science Foundation. They say indicator is a quantitative representation that might reasonably thought to produce summary information about a phenomenon or entity of interest, right? I think that the quantitative is a little bit too limiting. There's also qualitative indicators that we use. But one thing about indicators is that they're always proxies, and we just have to keep that in mind, right? Again, gross domestic product as a statement of the total economic output of a nation. In economics, we are well aware that GDP is incredibly flawed and doesn't actually measure economic output, and there are all kinds of problems with it. Yet we still use that statistic all the time because what else are we going to use, right? It's widely accepted. It's kind of standardized now. So even though it is an indicator of economic output, it is not, in fact, an exact statement of economic output. So we have to also keep in mind that in R&D, we can develop indicators, but they're almost always going to be proxy indicators. And so one indicator is not going to tell you the whole story, and it's not going to tell you the story accurately. So with that in mind, we started looking at this issue of the outputs of the Technology Transfer Office at the National Institutes of Health. So I'm going to take a detour into what does technology transfer mean. Just so you're aware that in 1980, there were two very seminal key pieces of legislation that were both passed in the same year. Keep in mind, at the time we were about to have, our basically beat in economic terms by the Japanese. We were convinced Japan was going to take over the world. There was a feeling that, we're spending all this money on R&D. It's not coming out as like competitive products and services in the world market. So we need to do something to basically spur the development of new innovation from these investments in R&D. So a lot of what we're talking about today. So first there was the Bayh-Dole Act, Birch Bayh and Bob Dole, right? Called the basically looking at if the federal government spent money on research at a university, and that research ended up with a patent, then the university by default would own the patent, except in very limited circumstances, right? And there are some requirements that the university has to do. They have to be able to provide a free license back to the government if needed. And sometimes the government can come in and actually take over the patent if they feel it's actually never been used, that authority, but that is a provision. But then once the university owns that patent, they can license it out to a Google or an IBM or Ford, whatever, right? They are actually supposed to prefer to license it to small businesses rather than large. They also have to try to make sure the licensee substantially manufactures the product in the US. That's obviously very difficult to do. And it's also very interesting because there's a royalty sharing involved. So the general split is whatever royalties that are earned from that patent, a third go back to the university researcher who was the inventor, a third goes to their lab, and like a third goes to the university as a whole. So this actually created an incentive mechanism for why researchers would be interested in seeing their research turn into commercial products, because they could actually also personally benefit from that happening. Well, there's a parallel to this in the federal labs. We had the Stevenson-Weidler Act, right? So every federal laboratory had to create this, what's called an ORTA, but really known as a tech transfer office or technology licensing office. The agency, in this case, lays claim to the patent. So if the Navy Research Lab invents something, the US Navy is the patent holder, right? And they claim the title of the invention. And then somebody, usually a private entity, can come along and say, we want to license that patent to use in a product. So the licensee has to actually apply for that license. They have to actually provide information like, well, how are you going to use the patent? Prove to us that you have the wherewithal to actually make a product and market it. Again, the licensee has to substantially manufacture the product in the United States, but there are waivers you can apply for. And then also, if they want to make the license exclusive, so only one company gets the license, you have to go through a whole process of disclosing that in the Federal Register. It's very hard to get to actually get approval of an exclusive license, but it does happen because, honestly, if you're a company, you'd prefer to have the exclusive license where you're the only one using that technology and not your competitors. But also there's this interesting profit sharing or revenue sharing agreement. So obviously not as lucrative as if you're a university researcher, but the federal lab researcher can get $2,000 and 15% of the royalties up to, at the time, $150,000 per year. The $150,000 per year, by the way, was set because you can't give that employee more than the salary of the president, because that would look bad. So anyhow, same kind of deal, right? So they basically, the federal lab invents something, they find a licensee in the private sector, they get this thing out, they get money back from the licensee, and that's kind of the outline of the tech transfer process, right? The research institute, the federal lab, does a lot of this original research, creates an invention, patents it. They then work with a company to license it to that company. The company invests the money to develop it, actually produce the sales. And at each one of these stages, there are royalties that accrue back to the federal lab. So you can have these milestone payments that just at the time you license, the company has to pay you a lump sum. When you actually show that you've met a development milestone, the company has to pay a lump sum. But the real money is in the royalty on sales, because this is generally a percentage of gross sales. So all the revenue from the product resulting from that license, you have to pay a certain percentage of that to the federal laboratory, and that's the royalty that the federal laboratory gets. And that's where you could get some big money, but not always, as I'll discuss. So the one interesting thing about this is that to calculate that royalty, the licensee has to send periodic sales reports back to the agency, right? If you're going to get a percentage of the sales as a royalty, then the licensee has to tell you how much they sold, so you can figure out what the fair royalty is. So when we worked with NIH, we got access to 40 years of licensing agreements and all the associated sales reports. So we knew what got licensed to whom. We had a fair way of figuring out which products were the result of those licenses, and we knew how much was the value of all the products that were then sold based on that license. This is actually a really powerful thing. Now, so getting back to the idea of like how do we get federal research and turn it into technologies, this is a very current topic of discussion right now on Capitol Hill and in Washington. And again, this turns on this idea of what is the return on investment in the federal research. In fact, this is a green paper that came out of NIST in 2019, which was aimed at trying to figure out how to accelerate the transfer of federal technologies. And they called it the Return on Investment Initiative, which I think was a very poor choice of words, but what are you going to do? But the point that was often made is that the federal government spends about $60 billion on R&D, that's at federal labs, intramural, and FFRDCs, versus $53 billion at university and nonprofit research institutes. And, are we getting the right bang for the buck for the $60 billion compared to the $53 billion? Right? That was the argument. So the Secretary of Commerce at the time, Wilbur Ross, got up at a meeting that I was at and said, basically, federally funded research is about 5 times more, federally funded university research is about 5 times more likely to result in a patent and about 7 times more likely to result in a license than the equivalent amount of spending at federal lab research. I have to kind of question, okay, is this a fair comparison to make, right? One thing you got to keep in mind is that what the federal government labs do as research isn't the same as universities. Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory does a lot of work on nuclear detonators. I don't want to see those being marketed, across the world. So there's just a limit to what you could possibly commercialize out of federal labs. They tend to do stuff that's very specialized to the mission of the agency that owns a lab. And so, you're comparing apples and oranges, right? Another thing that's actually very much underappreciated is that the vast majority, and this is based on economic research by Bhavin Sampat at Johns Hopkins and Al Link at UNC Greensboro, the vast majority of technology licensing offices at universities lose money. Almost every university spends more money on filing patents and maintaining those patents than they make in royalties. So even the universities might be doing more of this patenting and licensing, but it's actually not returning anything they're actually losing that money on that investment because you don't do tech transfer to make money. You do tech transfer for other reasons, which I can go into. So how do we kind of explain this in the context of the NIH Intramural Research Program? So again, this is research done by the scientists at the NIH campus. About $5 billion was spent in 2024. It's conducted by about 1,200 permanent PI. Well, now it might be less. We'll never know, but okay. And some short-term doctoral researchers. And 23 of the 27 institutes and centers at NIH have research done through the IRP, right? The main reasons why it does this, and not just extramural research, is that it's trying to advance the basic biomedical science, but also produces the knowledge, tools, and expertise to support the extramural performers, right? University biomedical researchers need some things, and sometimes the NIH intramural program is the entity that's best able to do that kind of research to provide it. So what happens is that then the technology transfer offices at the NIH look at the IRP research, they talk to the researchers, they determine, okay, did you actually invent something new that we can patent? And the tech transfer offices takes over the job of getting the patent, securing it, and finding licensees and negotiating those licenses to the qualified applicants. So this is, again, one way of looking at the impact of that research spending. You're getting technology out into the marketplace in private companies who then make stuff. So we said, okay, well, we should actually characterize this, right? How do you describe the impact pathways for this research spending at NIH? So you look at what are the primary outputs and outcomes, right? And then you look at what are the domains where you might detect this impact, right? So in this case, the domains where, NIH research actually impacts the way we innovate, right? They invent tools. So we do innovation better because of this research. It has economic impact. Again, the goods and services that are produced by the licensees, that produces economic impact. And then there's public health impact. A lot of what they're inventing are things that help us get new therapies, vaccines, treatments, medical devices, right? So we're all better off because we presumably are living longer and less prone to disease. So the issue is you need to find the relevant data for each of these domains and also figure out what is the real causal linkage, however tenuous, between the research spending and research activity and these outputs. And you'll see these aspects that we identified within each domain are basically expressions of this impact for that specific domain. And we had to develop or find specialized data sets that could describe a lot of these aspects, and they were specific to that aspect. So this is a general model we developed. This is actually looks like the linear model, but again, we have to measure something. So you have in this case, we start with the license, right? The license in many cases or some cases results in an actual licensing agreement. We have that documented. We know that exists, right? Then the licensee does R&D. The licensee, if they are successful, gets a product that they sell. Also, if successful, they somehow create some kind of a medicine or some kind of treatment. So we can say that we have some outcomes in the R&D innovation space, right? There's often the private licensee does additional R&D. So that's induced R&D investment from the private sector, right? You are enabling new approaches to R&D because you're developing these new research approaches and new research knowledge, right? And then you can see the long-term impact. For example, licensee is a startup company. They get this license from NIH. They've got a great product. They raise capital from venture capitalists or the public market, right? So a lot of these things you can trace back to that research project. On the sales side, it's a little bit more direct. You can say, again, if this license results in sales of a product, then we can calculate, again, what's the sales revenue, what are the salaries of the people who are supported by that sales revenue, and so on. And then even in medicine, right, we can see, okay, this license resulted in this new therapy. That therapy was put into the market. We have data on what has been the uptake of that therapy, for example, for treating specific diseases. There are public health databases that until recently existed that enabled us to do this. And then you can actually see, okay, how many people got this therapy and measure what were their outcomes, right? If they're living longer after the therapy came on the market and started being administered, then we can start to attribute public health outcomes to the NIH research. So let's look at kind of what's actually going on at the NIH and what are they commercializing, right? So this is just a chart that shows you kind of the relative ratio of, this is the licenses from 1980 to 2021. You'll notice that a large share of these were things like research reagents and cell lines, not particularly sexy technologies. Overall, over this 40-year time period, NIH received $133 billion in royalty payments, which is a lot, but then you think that NIH nowadays is spending about $48 billion a year in research. So it defrays some of the cost of the NIH research. It does help us because that means that that's money not coming from the treasury, it's coming from the licensees, and that helps us kind of fund additional research. What's interesting is that look at the pharmaceutical licenses, a small share of licenses produce about 40% of that $133 billion of royalties. So a small number of those licenses produced a lot of that financial return. If I were to try to maximize the financial return on the IRP, I would only patent pharmaceuticals, right? That's where the money is. Why do we bother inventing and licensing all this other stuff? Well, as we'll explain, things like research tools, you don't get new drugs without the research tools. So if we don't actually invest and commercialize and license the whole portfolio of technologies, the value that we get from any one category is going to be impaired. Right? However, those research reagents, for example, about 40% of all these licenses, they only generate 5% of revenue because research reagents are actually not really that expensive, and you can't get a lot of demand for them. So there's a big limitation there. So just real quick, I'm going to summarize some of the key findings of our project. One is that overall, from 1980 to 2021, there were $130 billion of gross U.S. sales for the products incorporating IRP technologies. For looking at just the period from 2001 to 2021, each year that supported about 75,500 jobs using IO modeling, which I'll go into detail in just a minute. That actually, there are about 1,700 patents that were filed and awarded to NIH. But 1,700 patents there were 148 patents associated with the top 100 products, and 1,700 patents by private companies referenced those 148 patents. So again, people are building on that NIH technology, right? There are 1,200 clinical trials that happened because of these technologies. For a particular therapy called Velcade that treats lymphoma, the average patient spent 6 fewer days off the job because of suffering from lymphoma because they were able to recover faster due to Velcade. And looking at, in this case, the HPV vaccine, Gardasil is one example that was entirely invented at NIH in Bethesda, and we were able to estimate that about 26,500 worldwide deaths per year are being avoided because of this vaccine. So this is kind of how we do that, right? We look at, these are the total sales. This is actually cumulative sales over time per year, but it's divided by the type of industry for the product. So we go back and reconstruct all the sales and then run these IO models for that period of time to try to find out how much of these sales then went to generate direct, indirect, and induced employment. This is not what UMR did, right? So United for Medical Research does IO modeling on just R&D spending by NIH. We're talking about like what actually happens to the R&D spending and what products are produced and what's the impact of those products. It's highly uncertain. It's, as you'll see, highly variable, but in our view, actually captures the meaning of what's going on here, right? You'll notice, of course, sales are, of course, again, dominated by pharmaceutical manufacturing. But even though we're looking at individual years of economic impact, this cumulative sales and cumulative impact is something that our model only allows us to look at the impact in a certain year, but we know those impacts probably continue to persist over time. So this is just looking at the employment impact, and you'll see that the employment impact of these sales were quite different by year. And I'll talk about it in a minute. That's because different products that were produced by licenses were variable in how much sales they produced. And so that variability in those sales leads to this variability in this chart. You may be curious as to what happened in 2021. I think it's probably not too difficult to guess. That was actually the COVID-19 vaccine, right? NIH patented the stabilization of the spike protein that was necessary to create the vaccine. They licensed that to Pfizer, Moderna, right? All these other vaccine manufacturers. Early estimate is that generated $1 billion in royalty alone in 2021 for NIH, that one invention. So that's a case where, okay, you got a pretty good return on investment, I think. But that is clearly exceptional, right? So the other thing to think about is all these drugs that were then spurred kind of follow-on clinical research, right? So somebody took an NIH invention, used that to produce a drug. They want to go to market. They've got to do FDA clinical trial protocol. They have to go through 3 phases of clinical trial, right? Clinical trials are an economic activity, right? I mean, running those trials takes money. It employs people. It employs people at medical schools and medical institutes and hospitals. And so even just the top 25 drugs by sales ended up being the subject of 1,200 clinical trials, because it's not just a trial to get regulatory approval. Once it's on the market, you have all these post-market trials like, oh, well, maybe if you combine it with this drug, you get better outcomes for this disease, or let me find another indication I can treat with that drug, right? So there's a lot of this ongoing activity just in the clinical research space that we also can take a look at, and we didn't even try to actually quantify the economic impact, but in theory, it could happen, right? You can just kind of argue that it's not just the sales, it's all this additional activity about getting the regulatory approval and post-market validation and so on that actually is also an economic engine. Again, turning to this, the research tools that they produce, right? So again, you'll see that the number of licenses was heavily favored research reagents and cell lines. The gross sales heavily favored drugs. But this is a chart that shows how many times different research tools have been licensed over this 20-year period. So the top one here, which is a cell line, has been licensed only by private licensees 171 times. That's 171 instances where this research tool was licensed by a private company, presumably to help them do their research and help them find new drugs, right? So again, NIH is giving you the infrastructure to enable and improve drug development in the United States, and doing it repeatedly. They're not making money on this or a ton of money on this. But again, those research tools, because they're not economically really that lucrative, the private sector is not going to build this stuff, right? NIH has to build this stuff. This is an eye chart. I apologize, but this is some tracing that we do in kind of innovation economics. So what you're looking at on the left are the NIH original patents that were filed and granted. And on the right are citations to those patents by private companies who are also NIH licensees. And what you're seeing is that the one single NIH patent So in patent law, there's a little bit of a weird kind of anomaly here, but when you file a patent, you have to reference if there was any prior patent that somehow is similar to your invention or contributed to your invention. So we can kind of loosely say, well, this patent that cites your original patent is a technology that was somehow, built or attributable to your first invention. And so we were just trying to say, well, how many patents downstream were in fact somehow connected to or building upon NIH patents? And really, patents are not cheap, right? So almost all technologies licensed did have this follow-on. The citations are kind of a sign that the downstream licensees are building new technology. And so essentially what you're saying is that there is induced investment in new technology and new products that were not at all from what NIH was doing, but still use that NIH invention as inspiration or as a component. And some of these things, again, there's one startup company that produced 578 patents based on just 3 of the NIH patents. So it's very highly variable. It's a little bit harder to interpret what's going on here, but basically the message is that the NIH inventions actually have dividends, essentially, to use another financial term, many years in the future across multiple technologies. I'll go real quick through these last few that are on the public health side. So Velcade, again, it treats lymphoma. We had our health economists go into public health databases. The nice thing about the Velcade is that there was no other treatment for lymphoma introduced at the same time. So when we looked at what were the observable change in patient outcomes for lymphoma, we could attribute almost all of it to the introduction of Velcade. And you see things like the average person who has lymphoma, they got 6 additional days of work. Also, their care teams didn't have to spend so much time, right? Their family members, friends didn't have to spend so much time taking care of them. So there's economic gain there. They had fewer hospital stays, so that's reduced strain on the hospital system. Again, these are all benefits that we don't ever talk about, but are attributable to this kind of research. And finally, the HPV vaccine, again, we're looking at here the uptake in the US market. So obviously the uptake of the HPV vaccine has been pretty dramatic over the years because there's a lot of cancers that could result from having HPV, the virus of HPV. So basically you can say, well, all the people who got this vaccine, what's the general incidence of cancer among people with the HPV virus? And now that we've prevented that, we've prevented a large number of cases of cervical cancer, for example. And we actually looked at global health databases and looked at both developing and developed countries to see what is a good estimate of how many lives, how many deaths were averted because of this invention. It's not insignificant. It's pretty, so again, these are things that we don't normally think about quantifying and measuring. Obviously, this is specific to NIH, so this is not going to work if you're talking about like NSF research, for example, or Department of Energy research, but you could replicate this in other domains with other research. Last couple of things. One is that this is actually even less straightforward than I'm describing, right? So one thing that we found when we were looking at the licensing data is that the time it takes to license a patent is actually usually very long. So you got to get the patent from the U.S. Patent Office. You got to go out and market around. You got to find a good licensee. The licensee then has to kind of negotiate. So this is basically the lag time from when the technology was licensed to when a product got FDA regulatory approval. And you'll see in many of these cases, it's actually quite long. Keep in mind that the term of a patent is only 20 years. So if it takes you 12 years to get from the license to the market, the patent was probably issued even before that point. You've only got about 3 or 4 years of royalty earnings before the patent expires and the license agreement goes away. This is why when we looked at those sales figures, we're actually drastically underestimating the sales figures because we only have the sales reports during the license term. We know those products continue to be sold after the license expires. We just have no way of measuring that. But this gives you an idea that technology transfer and commercialization is not an easy thing, and there's all these variables that are involved in terms of what is the timing of these benefits. This also gives you a kind of an idea here. So this is in every year, what you're looking at in the orange dots is the number of FDA-approved products that were based on technologies that NIH invented that year. And the blue bar is the sales of those products that were invented in that year. So you see what we see often in biomedical research. There are a couple of huge home runs, right? The COVID-19 vaccine, it's a shorter bar because we only had about a year's worth of royalty sales reports for just a couple of licensees. The big spikes in 2003 and 2006 was basically a drug-coated stent that allows you to put a stent in the heart and not have it accumulate blockage. Hugely successful. It got eventually licensed to Baxter. Within 2 years, it was off patent. So they got huge revenue in that 1 year, and then after that, NIH kind of didn't get any more royalties. Now the company continued to actually build new versions of the product, and they made billions of dollars after that. But that obviously did not accrue back to NIH. So last observations, some of the lessons that we learned from doing this project. I think you have to kind of look at these multiple domains to think about all the aspects of the benefits that can come from different types of research. Obviously, this is specific to biomedical research, but you can make analogous cases in other in other domains. And again, think about the benefit to the innovation ecosystem itself, the economic benefit of all the activity that's induced, and then also, in this case, the health benefits, right? But the data issues are really bad. I mean, we had access to these licensing records. Technology licensing information is highly proprietary to the companies that license it. They don't want to advertise what technologies they're getting from an external actor because that might give competitors some idea about what they're doing. And so, even universities could do this, but they don't make their licensing data accessible. And it's still not going to be precise. And really, what we're trying to do here is tell stories like Velcade, stories like Comirnaty, the COVID-19 vaccine. Use the data to talk about, here's an illustration of how the NIH IRP and its tech transfer officers really got this impact to happen. So and the other thing to recognize is that we will never fully capture the true value of the federal R&D outputs, right? So connecting outputs to outcomes are not very available. Licensing is actually only a small share of the outcomes from federal R&D. Attribution is always going to be difficult. Just as an example of this was what's called a teardown that was done several years ago of all the technologies that went into the old Apple iPod and where the funding for the development of those technologies came from. And you'll see there's multiple federal agencies that, all contributed technologies that were integrated into the iPod. I will guarantee you that if, any of these agencies are probably going to claim the entirety of the sales of the iPod to their research, but, that's the nature of how we work in government. But this is the idea, right? Like how much of the value of the iPod was really, based on DoD research. Hard to say, but, obviously it had a huge contribution, which is what we tend to focus on. But again, so doing just a financial analysis of the returns from federally funded research is a bad idea. So one is that trying to come up with an ROI number is always going to be misleading, right? So it focuses on the outcomes that you can monetize when there are all kinds of outcomes from federal research that are not financial in nature and don't result in just dollars being gained. So really try and think about how do we represent those non-monetary benefits. Just doing an ROI is also misguided because you're not supposed to be doing research at government agencies just to make money, right? You're doing research at government agencies to advance the mission, to produce benefits for the populace. If we only focused on earning the right return on the investment on that research, most of that research would not happen at all. And we would just be running government labs like corporate labs. And that's not why we do federal research. And my final argument is that this kind of accounting of ROI is incomplete. We cannot fully represent the actual value of research, even with our methodology, without getting with the existing data sets and the information that we have. And so we're even with our kind of accounting or our kind of capture of the value, we know we're not getting the whole picture. But if you just focus on the dollars, you're going to get even less of the picture that really counts. So thank you very much for taking the time to listen to me. I really appreciate you being here. This is my research team that did this work, and I'm happy to take questions.
So we have time for some questions. With that, we're going to start with the red microphone.
Bob Hershey, thank you.
I'm Bob Hershey. I'm a member. Could you tell us some more about some of these successful outcomes?
Sure. So actually, the website that's listed here, the Tech Transfer Office website, which has the whole report, we did 3 in-depth case studies as part of this project, which were the Comirnaty vaccine, but also deep TMS, transcranial magnetic stimulation, which is a method, basically technology for treating depression through basically transmitting magnetic waves into your brain. And I think Velcade was actually the 3rd. And so we did kind of talk about, for those successful cases, I think that's the thing, that we found these interesting cases from the quantitative data analysis. That gives you the beginning of the story. You then have to go back and actually reconstruct what happened. And that tells you really how did that research come to create this. So TMS is a widely accepted treatment for depression now. Interestingly, it was developed at NIH. It was an Israeli entrepreneur who had made a bunch of money on an internet company and decided he wanted to invest in biomedical technology. And he came to NIH and just started interviewing people at labs and found that this technology had been invented and created an entirely new company just to license that technology and commercialize it. So again, this is the kind of thing like, how do you predict that? How do you say that's going to be the certain outcome of this, right? These things happen for all kinds of strange reasons, but as long as we're able to facilitate that kind of technology transfer, you could get these very impactful outcomes.
Blue microphone.
Ciprian Ivanov, member, but any bureaucratic process has to account for self-delusion. After all, many therapies were introduced and had money spent on it and commercially viable for a while being net negative for health outcomes. If there is, in a culture of optimism bias, it seems like all the elements will be misaligned to result in suboptimal outcomes, even though they look financially viable and popular.
Question.
Yeah. So I think that, yes.
I didn't hear a question.
Fair point. Is there a mechanism for recognizing when the point of self-delusion has been reached in the commercialization process?
So I will answer that by saying one of the things that I recognize a lot, which is that, human psychology has a lot of problems and leads to a lot of poor outcomes. And those tendencies are actually magnified in organizations. So you could just as easily say, like, well, most companies also have the same self-delusions when they try to fund technologies. So, private sector R&D obviously has a negative ROI or negative outcomes associated with it, especially if you look at things like products that have bad safety outcomes. So again, we're not trying to say that all federal R&D is perfect, and also not all federal R&D is even beneficial. Part of the things that we're trying to work on is this idea of like a portfolio analysis, like how do you make sure that you get a certain set of positive outcomes when you know that you're going to have a lot of failures, and even in some cases. And we did look at, there are some case studies on the NIH website of products that were commercialized and then they were withdrawn because it turned out that they were faulty. It happens. There are ways to combat that on a case-by-case basis. I don't know of any way you could blanket kind of say, how do we make sure that everybody is giving a very realistic view of what their sales are or what's going to be successful. And in particular, the dot-com boom was, in my case, a very clear case of there's a lot of delusion to go around everywhere in the economy. And so if some of it also infuses federal research, that may not be that big of a, that notable of a deal.
Red microphone.
Hi, my name is Jason. I'm a member. I like your approach of turning things into a story, but from the perspective of if I am running a research portfolio or I'm the director of NIH, did you try to quantify the various indicators, like using a utility analysis or anything like that, to kind of try to compare apples and oranges and look at the outcome based on an approach or a process or something like that?
So we had very little visibility into the actual research project that led to the invention. So we don't know, for example, are there certain kinds of research done at the NIH campus that are more likely to result in a licensable invention? I suspect that there are. But again, I kind of push back on that entire premise because the point of doing research at NIH is not just to produce licensable inventions, it's to produce basic knowledge. So one thing that we have done, we worked on in another project, was just looking at publication outcomes. Really the outcome of research are scientific publications, right? And I have a lot of practice in the different ways that you can look at the impact of scientific publications. There's a lot of malpractice there, but you should realize that the point of research is to generate knowledge, and secondarily, some of these other things. So we could go back and try and figure out, okay, which projects led to the best inventions, and was there something special about that project? I don't think that that's going to give us actually useful information in the long run.
Blue microphone.
Hi,
your
my
hands
name
up.
is Rohini, and I'm not a member. I'm curious, do you think the private sector has a responsibility or more of a responsibility to invest in basic science because they really capture the majority of the economic returns of these federally funded technologies? And like, is that actually happening, or are there, new avenues to have that crosstalk happen of the companies give back to basic research labs, or is just some optimization there?
There's a long-term story here that large corporations did have large central research labs, Bell Labs, IBM, Watson Center, Dow Global Research, back in the 50s, 60s, 70s. They have largely disinvested in basic research for purely economic reasons, right? A lot of large corporations are public corporations. They have to show quarterly returns to stockholders. Putting a lot of money into basic research that may or may not pay off in 20 years is not a good way to invest that money. In fact, I have a professor who told an anecdote about General Dynamics was saying, "Oh, we're spending our money on the R&D for all these great things," and all at a financial conference, and all the analysts immediately ran out and called their headquarters and say, "Sell General Dynamics is a terrible idea," right? So I think that's the thing. There's well-known economic theory and empirical work that shows that the problem with basic research is that it's not, the value of it can't be captured by a single party because it is knowledge. So a lot of times a company is only going to make an investment if they know that they can actually get that return. And the nature of basic research is such that that return gets diffused throughout the entire economy and among all of their competitors. And so they are automatically less inclined to invest in basic research. As I mentioned, there is a big growth in basic research by companies recently. It's almost all attributable to about 3 or 4 companies, Google, Microsoft, Meta, because they just have a lot of cash and they're spending a lot of money on research.
IBM.
Yeah, IBM. Well, IBM is actually less so, but nowadays.
Spending a ton of money on quantum.
Yeah, well, quantitative, true. They are doing a lot of, but again, that's the thing. Those are very exceptional kind of cases, and it's really not. I don't think it's really the responsibility of companies because their responsibility is to their shareholders, not to society. To be quite honest.
I'm going to ask 2 questions that are but-for questions.
Okay.
First of all, if you try to do the same analysis on any one of these products, but instead of starting with the NIH, start with the pharmaceutical company and ask yourself, but for the pharmaceutical company's investment in a $250 million clinical trial, would that product have ever gotten to market?
Yeah.
And most of the time, the answer is no.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so the product development stream is not adequately analyzed by saying, okay, NIH did this basic research and that ended up in this product, and this product generated X amount of sales.
Yeah.
Because it's a much more complicated and risky process that involves a great deal of time and money and managerial decisions by the companies that end up developing the product.
Yeah. So
Isn't that true? Isn't that the case?
Okay. So I'm in violent agreement with you, right? So, and that's the thing that's dangerous about this kind of analysis in general, right? How do you attribute, again, if like the COVID-19 vaccine, is it the fact that all the value is attributable to NIH? No, of course not. I mean, the BioNTech did this crazy research that, with mRNAs that nobody thought was going to work. Moderna actually was backed by DARPA money first before NIH money. So, I mean, this is the thing, the attribution and contribution are different ideas. But if you're trying to figure out, again, what is the benefit, again, the actual attribution of the benefit should be shared among all the investors. And, in almost all these cases, the private sector ended up investing more than the government.
So here's my other but-for question.
Okay.
And this is a question.
Okay.
So what do you think would be, how do you think your analysis would go if you treat economic and activity as a moving dynamic system, and it didn't have this federal money being spent, and there wasn't basic research being done by the federal government? What would the companies do then?
that's a question that we may be learning the answer to in real time. I mean, there are economic studies that actually, and so there are a couple of ways you can attack this problem. We did what I call a microeconomic approach, like look at the individual cases and companies and kind of build up your argument. There's a lot of economic theory that's the macro. So look at how do we calculate the total factor productivity or the increased productivity based on investments in R&D. And again, the thing is that if you reduce basic research, you probably won't see the negative outcomes anytime soon, because this is the phrase you're going to eat your own seed corn, right? So we're not planting more seeds. We still can get plenty of value from the crops that we've already grown. The problem is going to be, the companies will get to a point where they can't innovate anymore. The other thing that I didn't mention actually that is worth mentioning about the value, because we didn't talk about this in the report, but I think it's incredible. The value of federal basic research funding, I would say, is not really in any of these technologies. That money goes to train graduate students and researchers, and those researchers go to run labs. And the private sector is dependent upon the training that federal research supports to get the human capital to innovate.
It builds the infrastructure.
Yeah, and builds the infrastructure.
I am, 100% on board with that. But I do think these analyses need to be done both ways.
Yeah, and we're trying to do that.
Chain. So where is the microphone? Red, Aki.
Yes. Aki Roberge, member. Okay, obviously this is extremely complicated analysis. I was wondering if there's even a hope of being able to understand the value of research that is so basic it never gets patented, like quantum mechanics or relativity or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, so a number of organizations have done, and I've done this before, technology tracing. So you can't, you can kind of say like, okay, here's a technology that was commercialized. There's a very famous set of studies done in the early 70s that looked at like the videotape or VCR birth control pill, right? So you can say, and they actually looked at like what was the scientific literature, right, that led to this. There actually is a very good study that's come out of Northeastern University, where they looked at commercialized drugs that were FDA approved, and then looked through the entire record and saw what kinds of scientific articles were cited in the regulatory approval process to justify that this was an efficacious drug. And the conclusion of that is that 99% of the drugs on the market today in some way were based on knowledge that was generated by NIH funding. And that's university research funded, paid by NIH as well as the intramural. But I think that's another way that we're trying to do this, is that citation tracing or publication tracing. People are reading these articles from these research labs. That's informing what they do in the private sector or in the private lab. Again, the actual share of attribution is hard to say, but there is clearly an impact there.
Blue microphone, then the red microphone.
Yago Pinal, almost a member. I pay the fees.
No, you're either a member or you're not a member.
I pay the fees, but I'm still not. I didn't receive the confirmation,
All right.
so almost. So I work at the NIH, at the Intramural Research Program, and one thing that you didn't mention that I think is very, very important to understand the analysis, and I think they changed dramatically the analysis that you said, is that when you try to patent something at the NIH, one of the questions that you get is, the patent is going to make the product easier to reach the public. And if the answer is no, even if your product has economic value, then you cannot patent it.
Right.
So I would say that more than 90% of the things that are patentable at the NIH, they are not patented and they are just published and they are given for free to any company that wants to use it.
Yeah.
So that I think is important in this.
So that is it is true. I mean, it is very NIH specific. Because again, a lot of NIH, they're not in the business of licensing technologies to sell extremely costly drugs, right? In theory, they want their technologies to reach as many patients as possible. It's interesting. When I talked to the head of Stanford Technology Licensing Office for many years, Kathy Koo, Stanford does not exclusively license research tools for the same reason. They can make more money by exclusive licensing, but they want to get the tech tools out to as many people as they can. So, I mean, this is the issue. Like, universities tend to over-patent. Federal labs probably tend to under-patent. Whether it is actually an efficacious policy to say that NIH should only patent if they can guarantee that the resulting therapy is more widely available, I don't think I have an informed way of analyzing that. but I can see the rationale for the argument. But this is actually right now also being debated because that policy may change in the near future.
It's also partially because of that. There are very few justifications for delaying the publication, except if it is a treatment.
Right.
Could you repeat what he said?
Oh, so yeah. So basically, one of the problems of that, I guess, yeah, if it's going to delay the treatment because you're waiting to file the patent and get it approved and get the license, whereas if you just get the knowledge out the door, then people can use that and generate their own treatments and inventions, right? The bias is towards just go ahead and publish, right? So if you know anything about patenting, once you publish something, it's no longer kind of new to the world, and so you actually invalidate the later patent application. So the problem with a public research institution like the NIH and some universities has this problem, right? They will like to publish the knowledge as soon as possible. And in many cases, that basically essentially closes off or closes them from ever getting a patent and licensing the technology. That's, again, a value judgment about is knowledge more valuable than the technology potentially.
Speaking as a patent attorney, let me
Okay.
let me
Sorry,
a note of clarification. First of all, in the U.S., you can publish your results before you file your patent application. You have a year
Yep.
to file your patent application. Second of all, if you have a preprint, you can take the preprint and you can make some claims and you can file a reasonable patent application that will allow you to protect your rights abroad.
Yeah.
So depending on the bureaucratic impediments and the delay in the bureaucracy, you should be able, the patenting should not get in the way of publication in a material way.
I mean,
I'm
this
not
is-
saying it's a practical matter that it doesn't, but it doesn't have to. The other thing is that there's a trade-off between making everything available for free and providing exclusive licenses. And the trade-off is that it's available to everybody for free. There's not much of an incentive for somebody who's contemplating a $50 million or $100 million or $1 billion investment to make that investment if they're not going to be able to get exclusive rights. And I can't say which is the better way to go, but I can say that that's the way it's looked at. If you're contemplating undertaking this very risky development process to perhaps produce a new drug or whatever it is, that's going to be costly, time-consuming, and may not work out, then you're going to want to have exclusive rights. You do not want to be in the position of spending 5 years, 25% or 100% of your company to end up developing something great, and then somebody else can just imitate it and not have had to spend all that money and compete with you in the marketplace.
So I'll just note that is the entire rationale for why Bayh-Dole and Stevenson and Weill
Right.
were
It did.
passed, because originally, if you did research that was fairly funded, automatically you had to make it available for free to the entire world. And so therefore nobody was actually commercializing anything because they're like, why would I pay to commercialize this when somebody else can just take that idea and steal it? It was only after they established this domain of proprietary right that it spurred licensing. Now there's a movement to revisit Bayh-Dole, and maybe there are things we need to fix about Bayh-Dole. It's a lot of controversy right now, but I think there is a rethinking about that rationale. But I think the fundamental rationale exists that proprietary rights tend to induce investment. So we can't just remove all proprietary rights to federally funded inventions because we would get much worse outcomes in most cases. So.
Red microphone.
Yeah.
Thank you for
Yes,
bearing
thank
with
you.
me.
My name is Frederica Derima, and I'm a member. So I wanted to ask the question, how the work you're doing can help, you think can help the agencies now to make the case in the era of challenged funding. And I want to put my question in context. You talked about, first of all, you talked about patents, and there's much more than patents, and I will go back to that. And you talked about lower bound, and I think this is a key word, because maybe the lower bound of return on investment or value can be good enough to help make the case of the value of fundamental research, basic. The other, the other aspect is when you talk about return, and you alluded a little bit to the students, but it's not only the students that are educated and go and create on other companies. And I want to go back to your Google example, which I think is very good. And I would claim that the numbers you gave are a lower bound, even the trillion, because there were a lot of other people that were educated under the work that was done, either in universities, created other companies. And I think
Question.
we can, in a sense, well, you took a lot of time.
Yeah, but I'm the president. I'm the president, and sometimes I get to take a
The
liberty.
members,
Right.
thank
There you go.
And the other thing is, a lot of the research funding enables discoveries of new physics laws, all right? And these are non-patentable.
Yeah.
So there is a much...
So again, this idea of lower bound absolutely I think is true. I mean, if you can make a case that even the lower bound makes it worth it, then that's going to help us out quite a bit. I mean, the case of Google, it's not that it did not produce a positive return to society, because I think it did. The problem I have is this point precision that we know exactly what the ROI is, which people will then look at that and say, that's patently ridiculous, therefore all your arguments are trash, which is what is happening on Capitol Hill right now. If you're giving a non-credible argument that you can't back up with a really crazy number that you produced with a really poor methodology, eventually it'll be used as the argument to say, no, this research is just not even worth it because clearly they don't know what they're doing, right? So that's what I think is part of the danger of like not doing this carefully. Now, how this can actually help us make an argument for justifying public investment in research, I'll admit I don't have the answer to that. It is a complicated study that we did. I think that the idea that we did, and we have an article in the journal Issues in Science Technology that's based on this, where we're trying to distill this complex study into a few key messages, like, investing in research tools matters, and NIH is the only one that's doing it right now, right? Things like, there are public health benefits that are clearly quantifiable that we just tend not to take into account if we're only judging federal technology transfer by royalty dollars earned. So I think those kinds of arguments are the ones that I tend to focus on. Like, what's the real benefit? Like, the benefit is not the royalties. The royalties are great. Even universities mainly do technology transfer for marketing purposes, not for royalties. They want people to see that they're inventing useful stuff and they're getting it out in the marketplace. And that's why they don't mind losing money on it. In a good case like this, like Yahoo was a spin out from Stanford. Yahoo was not anything that was patentable. Yahoo did not give a license. Stanford got an entire building from Akiko Yamazaki and Jerry Yang. So they got a positive ROI on that work too. So that's the thing, that these kinds of dynamics are, they're aspects you should take into
What
account.
Stanford got back is what society got back.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, society as well, obviously. So,
Thank you.
yeah.
Blue microphone.
Joseph Crandall, member. Can you discuss the intersection between federal funding for basic and advanced research through both grant and equity vehicles and the formation of the American Sovereign Wealth Fund?
Whoa.
That's quite a tangent. The idea of the federal government taking equity as a form of royalty is actually illegal. So that shouldn't be happening. I'm not saying it's not happening. As somebody I talked to recently, if it happened, therefore it must be possible. Doesn't mean that it's legal. NIH does a lot of licensing to startups where they don't take equity per se, but they take a warrant. Like, we're not going to own shares in your company, but in lieu of giving us a cash payment, you promise that when you IPO, you're going to make us a cash payment, right? So that's about the closest thing. The idea of like investing in startups as a government to, drive the value of a sovereign wealth fund's assets is, I have my opinion about it. It's not relevant to this discussion.
Thank you for that. All right, we're going to go to the red microphone. We'll take one or two more, and then we'll wrap up. Yes, Red.
Yeah, name is Al Ehrlich. I am a member. You sort of answered one of two questions I had when you discussed a bit the enhancement of the scientific base by these programs training young people. But is there any thoughts of, or any one doing, a soft power play? That is to say, the kind of thing that the U.S. got by the space program. I mean, if they develop a COVID vaccine and it's helping a lot of countries, or any new process or treatment, is there anyone who tries to do something useful for the country in that soft power type way?
Yeah, I think there's an example of some of those non-quantifiable, non-monetary benefits. I think that, again, the U.S. doing research and releasing the benefits to the world. Gardasil, right? Yes, Merck made money on that, but it benefited a lot of developing countries, and it was distributed at very low cost to those countries. So one, I think in terms of like U.S. investing in science, technology, and R&D, because it helps to show our goodwill and the fact that we're taking these benefits and sharing them abroad is some people are looking at that. Obviously, science diplomacy is a real thing, and I think also this idea of the brand value of R&D essentially, right? So how do we inspire the next generation of scientists and engineers if we're not investing in science and engineering, right? And again, like the Apollo program and the National Defense Education Act that followed it was a good way to kind of get kids involved in science and engineering and then actually train them to become scientists and engineers. There's talk about an NDEA 2.0 possibly being passed.
So there are agencies actually devoted to this.
I mean, that's actually a big part of NASA's, I think, public communication, although I think there's some NASA people who can tell me more. But I mean, again, a lot of what, when I was doing research on what is the benefit of the research on the space station for NASA, which is a project we did about 8 or 9 years ago, we didn't try to quantify it, but we did mention that, kids like have their experiments launched onto the space station and it's like a cool thing and they can talk about that and there's value in that capability. Is that justifying the whole expense of the space station? Probably not. But yeah, I think that is a benefit that some people are at least bringing up and probably deserve some more.
And it's more than just NASA who does this.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Blue microphone. I think maybe we're at the end of the questions. So with that, let's thank our speaker and... Oh, wait. One more red microphone.
Yes, good evening. Thank you. Michael Yatamarco, member. Thinking about the president's second question, have you encountered or conducted analyses of an international comparisons to strengthen your arguments?
So in terms of like the value of public investments in research here versus another country,
Right.
No, data comparability is a nightmare. So you're dealing with another currency, you're dealing with an entirely different science system. Our science system is fairly unique in the world. Like in a lot of other countries, the universities are all public entities. So that's actually government research is all the university research. I know that there are studies about looking at cross-national comparisons in kind of just science technology capability. I don't think doing this kind of study would really yield the amount of effort it would take to get a truly comparable figure would not justify the benefit of having that figure.
Yeah, thank you.
Any other questions? Hearing none, let's thank our speaker.
Thank you.
Before you go, we have a few gifts for you. A framed copy of the announcement of your talk, a copy of volume 17 of the PSW Science Bulletin, originally the Bulletin of the Philosophical Society of Washington, which contains formative papers, a list of the founders, a list of our Henry speakers, Nobel Prize winners, and the address of Joseph Henry, describing why the organization was formed, why it was called the Philosophical Society, which meant science in those days, and some interesting comments on how discourse of a scientific nature should be conducted that is very good for all of us to read periodically because it's very reasoned. And you'll also find 3 histories of the Philosophical Society in there. So when you're on a plane flying back from Brazil and you're not falling asleep,
thank you.
This will be a great aid. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Really appreciate it. You too.
And with that, we have just a few closing announcements. Our next lecture will be by Rosalie Lopez of the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, and she'll be speaking about volcanism and cryovolcanism in the solar system, especially on the icy worlds like Enceladus and Titan. So do show up for that. The last talk of the year will be by Davey Smith. He's going to be speaking on rapid autopsies, which are people who have donated themselves after they die to be immediately autopsied. Apparently, bodies degrade very quickly, and where viruses are in the body are not the same within a very short period of time after death. And so he has developed this program to carry out autopsies very soon after death to try to discover where HIV reservoirs are in the living person. And then the first lecture of the new year will be by Bernard Carlson of UVA, but actually mostly University of Galway these days. And he'll be giving a talk on the life and times and inventions and discoveries of Nikola Tesla. This has nothing to do with the car company. And then finally, I'm only going to mention the annual President's Lecture will be on January 23rd this year. The speaker will be Gordon Guyette of McMaster University, and he'll be talking about GRADE, one of those nice acronyms, which is a system for grading the objective value of evidence that's used to guide clinical practice that is finding adaptation around the world. So with that, please check the PSW website often for updates as we post additional lectures for the coming year. And let's thank the people who are running cameras and the sound and the rest. Thank you all. You're all invited to become members if you're not already members. There's a little business card at the back with QR code that will facilitate joining. And remember that all members are invited to a reception and dinner with the speaker before the lecture. With that, please remember to return your name badges when you leave. And I will entertain a motion to adjourn the meeting to the social hour. I have a second already, and all members in favor? All members opposed? Meeting is adjourned to the social hour. Thank you all for coming.